This is Kol Birama, the podcast of Congregation Ramat Raz 929 Tanakh Project. Join us each day as we study a chapter of Tanakh, building towards completing all 929 together. I'm Rabbi Yoni Zolti, and I'm glad you're here. Shemot Chapter 7. Like Chapter 6, Chapter 7 presents us with what appears to be yet another recommencement of the narrative. Once again, Hashem addresses Moshe and Aaron, commanding them to secure Israel's release from Egyptian bondage. This apparent redundancy demands explanation. Why does the text circle back repeatedly to the same commission? Following the interpretive framework we established in our discussion of Chapter 6, I will propose that each iteration serves a distinct theological function, presenting progressively more developed dimensions of the divine plan. The first iteration of chapters 3 and 4 emphasized humanitarian concern for Israel's suffering. God hears the affliction of the oppressed and responds with compassion. The second foregrounded the covenantal relationship between God and the patriarchs. Liberation flows from divine fidelity to sworn commitments made to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. This third version, however, introduces an entirely different focus: the cosmic confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Here, Israel's liberation emerges almost as a secondary consequence of a more fundamental necessity: the reassertion of divine sovereignty over creation itself. The contest between God and Pharaoh represents nothing less than a battle over the nature of reality. Who truly governs the world? Whose will shall prevail? What conception of power and authority will define existence? The shift in emphasis becomes immediately apparent in the chapter's opening verses. Notably absent is any direct address to the Israelites themselves. Gone, too, is the covenantal language that characterized the previous iteration. Instead, the narrative concentrates exclusively on God's strategy regarding Pharaoh and the divine plan to demonstrate supremacy over Egypt's sovereign. The text articulates this with striking clarity. Vani akshe et lev Paro v'hirbeiti et ototai v'et mofetai b'eretz Mitzrayim. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. This declaration establishes a paradoxical dynamic. Pharaoh will refuse to release Israel, and yet Israel will nevertheless be freed. This differs fundamentally from the first version's implication that Pharaoh would eventually relent through conventional persuasion. Here, the emphasis falls not on Pharaoh's potential change of heart, but on God's determination to extract maximum demonstration of divine power from the confrontation. The divine objective crystallizes further in verse 5. V'yadeu Mitzrayim ki ani Adonai b'intoti et yadi al Mitzrayim. And Egypt shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand over Egypt. The plague narrative that follows will repeatedly return to this refrain, the epistemological dimension of the contest. This is not merely about liberation. It concerns recognition, acknowledgement, and the reestablishment of proper cosmic hierarchy. To fully appreciate the significance of this divine, pharaonic confrontation, we must recognize what is ultimately at stake. The book of Exodus presents God's involvement in history as intrinsically connected to the success of the divine project initiated at creation. God fashioned humanity b'tselem Elohim, in the divine image, endowing humans with creative capacity, moral agency, and the dignity of meaningful choice. This divine image represents humanity's essential nature and purpose. Yet, throughout Genesis, we witnessed repeated threats to this foundational project. The generation of the flood demonstrated how unchecked violence and moral corruption threatened to annihilate the divine image entirely. The Tower of Babel revealed a different danger: the totalitarian impulse to impose absolute uniformity, crushing the diversity and creativity essential to human flourishing. In both instances, God intervened not capriciously, but because the divine project itself faced existential threat. Egypt, under Pharaoh, represents the return of this totalitarian specter. Indeed, it constitutes a systematic reversal of the creation order itself. Consider the evidence of this anti-creation ideology. First, Egyptian civilization was predicated on the absolute deification of Pharaoh and the divine status of Egypt's pantheon. Pharaoh himself makes this explicit when he declares his ignorance to Moshe, Lo yadati et Adonai. I do not know the Lord. This is not mere personal unfamiliarity, but an ideological declaration. In Egyptian cosmology, Paro himself was divine, the earthly embodiment of Ra or Horus. The Nile, which sustained all Egyptian life, was itself worshipped as a god. The very structure of Egyptian theology left no conceptual space for a transcendent creator who stands above creation. Instead, Egypt's gods were the natural order: the sun, the river, earth, fertility. To acknowledge a god beyond these forces would undermine the entire Egyptian worldview, and more critically, Paro's claim to divine sovereignty. Second, this theological framework produced a society built on rigid, immutable hierarchy. Egyptian civilization was structured as a cosmic pyramid, with Paro at its apex descending through priests and nobles to the common people, with slaves occupying the lowest rung. This was not merely social organization, but theological necessity. Each person's station reflected their place in the divine order. Human dignity and potential for moral growth, the very essence of Tselem Elohim, was replaced with ontological caste. Where Genesis envisions humanity as partners in divine creativity, Egyptian ideology reduces the masses to mere instruments of pharaonic will. Third, and most tellingly, Paro's response to Israel's population growth reveals his fundamental assault on the divine image. When he observes that they multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, the very fulfillment of God's creational mandate, pru uravu, to be fruitful and multiply, Paro responds not with wonder, but with terror. He decrees to murder every male infant, in effect attempting to reverse creation itself, to prevent human flourishing and eliminate the people through which God sought to maintain covenant relationship with humanity. The further systemic subjugation, the forced labor, the murderous decrees, the crushing of human spirit through relentless oppression, constitutes nothing less than an organized assault on Tselem Elohim. By attempting to eradicate the very people designated to serve as God's covenant partners and ambassadors to humanity, Paro threatens the entire apparatus through which God seeks to maintain relationship with creation. Had he succeeded, the divine project that began at creation would have collapsed entirely. This explains why the covenant referenced in chapter 6 carries such profound significance. It represents not merely God's commitment to Israel, but God's commitment to the viability of creation itself. This framework illuminates why God cannot simply extract Israel from Egypt through immediate supernatural rescue. Such extraction would free the slaves, but would fail to address the fundamental crisis: Paro's challenge to divine sovereignty itself, and more broadly, Egypt's ideological replacement of the creator with creation. The plague sequence thus serves a purpose far more comprehensive than securing Israel's release. It systematically dismantles Paro's pretensions to godhood and reestablishes proper understanding of cosmic hierarchy. The refrain that punctuates the plague narrative makes this objective explicit. V'yadeu Mitzrayim ki ani Adonai, and Egypt shall know that I am the Lord. Or later on, Bizot teda ki ani Adonai, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Or later, Leman teda ki ani Adonai bekerev haaretz. Or even later, Ba'avur teda ki ein kamoni b'chol haaretz. Again and again, God declares that the purpose of these plagues is so that you shall know my name throughout the earth. This is not divine ego demanding acknowledgement, but rather the Creator reasserting a relationship with creation. God must reintroduce himself as the one who fashioned the world with purpose, who remains invested in that purpose, and who will not permit his creation to be hijacked by human tyranny. The repetitive insistence on knowledge addresses Egypt's foundational ignorance, the lo yadati, with which Paro began the confrontation. The plagues themselves enact this reestablishment of divine authority over creation's elements. By demonstrating control over water, over earth, air, and the celestial bodies, precisely those very elements that Paro and Egyptian theology claim to control or even worship as divine, God systematically dismantles the theological foundation of pharaonic absolutism. Each plague, in effect, declares the creator who brought these elements into being retains authority over them, and no human sovereign, regardless of pretension, can usurp that authority. The Nile, worshipped as a god, becomes blood. The sun, embodied in Ra and Paro himself, is darkened. Creation answers to its creator, not to Egypt's false theology. Chapter 7 thus initiates not merely Israel's liberation, but the restoration of proper cosmic order. The confrontation between Moshe and Paro represents the collision between two incompatible visions of reality: Paro's claim to absolute sovereignty and Egypt's worship of creation, versus God's assertion of creatorial authority and transcendence. What unfolds in the chapters ahead will determine not only Israel's fate, but whether Tselem Elohim, the divine image in humanity, can survive and flourish, or whether it will be crushed beneath totalitarian domination. This third iteration of the Commission thus reveals the deepest dimension of the Exodus. It represents God's return to active involvement in history at a moment when creation itself seems to hang in the balance. Against Egypt's theology of immutable hierarchy and deified nature, God reasserts the Genesis vision: a transcendent creator who fashioned humanity in his image, who calls them to partnership rather than subjugation, and who remains committed to ensuring that Tselem Elohim can flourish in the world he created for that very purpose. Thank you for joining today's learning. See you tomorrow for the next chapter of Tanakh.